Okay, we'll get started here. It is 2 minutes after noon. So again, welcome to the board 2024. Congratulations to all of the new board members. Thank you for stepping up for your community. And we also welcome with open arms experienced board members. It's always good to get a refresher in training. My name is Stephanie Verdile. I am a principal planner here with the Office of Planning and Development. And with me today is Principal Planner Noah Hodgetts. He's helping us keep on track with time and will help us out with questions. So the agenda for today, for the new board members, and in case you weren't aware, I'm going to go through a brief introduction of the Office of Planning and Development, and then move into some definitions and terms for planning and zoning, a little bit of the history of zoning in the United States and in New Hampshire, review the land use law sections, ones that you'll be working with, an introduction to what is defined as a New Hampshire Land Use Board, review board responsibilities. I'll give you some tips on how to be a good board member, a little bit of some planning and zoning acronym alphabet soup, and then we'll go into our question and answer period. So quickly, we are now the Office of Planning and Development. We are now located, we have been since 2021, but we are now located within the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. That became effective in July of 2021. Before we were the Office of Planning and Development, we were the Office of Strategic Initiatives. Before that, we were the Office of Energy and Planning, and before that, we were the Office of State Planning. So we've been around for quite a few decades. Just our name has changed, but our purpose has not. We are still involved with training and all of our technical assistance programs that we do. Currently, we are housed with the Department of Business and Economic Affairs, which includes several other offices, the Division of Economic Development, Travel and Tourism, Outdoor Recreation. So there's quite a few offices here that underneath the BEA banner. So our Office of Planning and Development, Heather Shank is our director and the senior planner here for OPD. In the Municipal and Regional Assistance Program, you have myself, Noah, and our assistant planner, Alvina Snagach. Heather is also the state floodplain coordinator, so she right now is working in the floodplain management program. And we are also the Office for the State Data Center, and our colleague, Principal Planner Ken Gallagher, works in the State Data Center and with the GIS. So OPD, like I said, with many name changes, we still have the same functions. We are mainly focused on training, technical assistance, data, resources, and coordination with other services and with other trainings. So in our floodplain program, currently out of 234 municipalities in the state, 220 of them participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So our office is the state coordinating agency for FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. So what that means is that a community has adopted floodplain regulations and floodplain to regulate floodplain development. And in return for having those regulations for floodplain development, FEMA offers that community buy-in to the National Flood Insurance Program. As we all know, lately, in the past several years, that flooding is becoming it's becoming more and more of an occurrence here in New Hampshire. It is the #1 natural disaster. So if you have any questions or need any additional information, I put the link to our floodplain management program on our website in the slide there. So please feel free to reach out to us. Also in our office is the State Data Center. We have been a partner with the U.S. Census Bureau since 1982. This office is in charge of doing the population estimates as well as population projections. So that demographic information you can find on our website. The link is on the slide. And Ken Gallagher is the contact person for any questions you may have on that. And then the Municipal Regional Assistance Program, the MRA program. Myself, Noah, and Alvina primarily work here. We provide technical assistance to planning and zoning regulations to planning and land use boards. We receive up to 300 technical assistance inquiries annually through our MRA program that we answer to. We conduct annual updates to the Office of Planning and Development's, the Planning Board Handbook and the Zoning Board Handbook based on any legislative changes. We conduct the annual survey of municipal land use regulations. We are required by law to be the repository of the regulations statewide. We administer the targeted block grant program to the RPCs, which is a small amount of state funding that's given with every budget to these RPCs. And we provide training to mostly our role is to provide training to planning and land use boards. And you can find more information on the MRA program through the link in the slides. And as new board members, you may not be aware, but there is an RSA that any member of a zoning board or planning board may complete training offered by the Office of Planning and Development or another organization that provides similar training covering the processes, procedures, regulations, and statutes related to the board on which the member serves. So there was an update to that law in 2022 where we were mandated to develop standardized self-training materials and coordinating tests for zoning board and planning board members. So we do have those trainings available on our webpage. As a result of that, we have 30 questions on these tests that it's open book. It's based on our handbooks. And you can check out the handbook and the tests on the links provided in the slide. There are two options to take with the planning board and the zoning board handbook tests. One of them is you can receive a certificate that's showing that you've passed the test. In order to get a certificate, we do need your email address to email it back to you. But we do not share email addresses. So by giving our email address to receive the certificate, that's as far as it would go. And again, the zoning board handbook is the same thing. There's 30 questions. It's based on knowledge within the handbook. The links are there on the slides and on our webpage if you want more information or interested in taking the test. See how well you do. And these are our planning board and zoning board handbooks. Again, they are available on our website. They are up to date from the 2023 legislative session. And we've also started something in 2023, a federal and state planning and zoning case law handbook. This is to kind of separate out, and if you want a quick reference guide to what the New Hampshire Supreme Court has decided with land use cases or some federal cases decided by the New Hampshire Supreme Court, or excuse me, the United States Supreme Court. We try to track those and keep them in the handbook just for references. We don't give any opinion on them. It's just to make those cases make you aware. And so again, for your reference and your convenience, here's the links to the publications on our website for the planning board, the zoning board, and the handbook for cases. So now I'm going to begin with, what's the difference between planning and zoning? And these terms are often used interchangeably. Oh, I'm doing planning work, I'm doing zoning work, I'm on land use board, planning board, zoning board. I just want to make some clarifications to make it a little bit easier to understand zoning and planning and understand the roles of zoning board and the planning board. So the definition of zoning is the legal process for regulating type, location, size, density of land uses through regulations and documents. So that would be through your zoning ordinance and your zoning map. That's what zoning is. Those are your regulations. Planning is the legal decision-making process in which communities' goals and objectives for deciding the future uses and future locations of uses of land are established through regulations and through planning principles. Now, both planning and zoning are community-based, meaning that individual communities can decide, number one, whether or not they even want zoning. And if they do, then they can decide what types of uses and where those uses can be located within their own community. So what works in Alton is not going to work in Salem. So every community has the ability to decide whether or not they want zoning, and decide what type of zoning, what type of land uses, where and when for their own community. Both planning and zoning are considered, the regulatory framework. This is what controls the uses and the locations in your communities. Zoning can say where, and planning is the decision-making process implementing those. And mostly when we talk about land use regulations, we use that general term. It's inclusive, at least according to how I use it. It's inclusive of the zoning ordinance, the subdivision regulations, and the site plan regulations. Those are like the top ones that a planning board and a zoning board are going to work with. It does also include a few other regulations that the planning board is in charge of. There's excavation regulations, but those are, I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. And so you're wondering, why do we have planning and zoning? What is the basis? Why did we have planning and zoning in New Hampshire? And within both planning and zoning definitions, you're going to see probably, and it'll be in your subdivision regulations, it should be in your site plan regulations, it definitely should be in your zoning ordinance, but the overall general purpose of planning and zoning is to promote the health, safety, and welfare of the community. And through New Hampshire, that's done through RSA 674-16. It's called the grant of power. And part of that RSA says, for the purpose of promoting the health, safety, or the general welfare of the community. So that's the classic basis for why you have planning and why you have zoning. Why do we have these regulations? Why do we say that, a car automatic or automated car wash has to go in the, business area, not in a residential zone? So those are the types of things that, to promote the health, safety, and welfare, that's what it comes from, for community uses and land uses and where they're appropriate in your community. And planning and zoning, again, like I said, is focused on zoning ordinance, and the maps is where you get your zoning from. And it's supported through all of your land use regulations. So that would include your subdivision and your site plan regulations. And that the grant of power is based on whether or not that community's legislative body wants to adopt zoning. And some examples of why we have zoning. This is the one that I've used in the past. It's kind of a really good visual for how zoning came into play. In 1916, this building called the Equitable Building was built in New York City. And even though that's a cartoonish kind of rendering, you can see that the building towered over neighboring buildings. It took up the whole entire lot. It blocked all available land on that lot. It blocked windows. It blocked light. It blocked circulation of air. It made, living there pretty unpleasant. So what had happened was that was basically one of the triggers for the first zoning ordinance in the country to be implemented in New York City in 1916. In 1926, the constitutionality of zoning was upheld, and that case that went before the United States Supreme Court is the Village of Euclid, Ohio versus Amber Realty. And that's where the Supreme Court established the legal principle and practice of a municipality separating land uses into zones, essence zoning. And the court decided and determined that zoning is legal because the government has a valid interest in the overall health, safety, and well-being of the community. Again, back to that overall health, safety, well-being of the community. That's kind of where the term Euclidean zoning came from. And so early planning came from the first examples was the system of land grants going way back with the expansion westward. And you can tell if you've ever, seen maps or, of the West and the Midwest are much different than they are in the Northeast. Very grid system, very squared off. It's much different here than in the Northeast. But during the Industrial Revolution, businesses, started to be moving in, and mills started to become part of New Hampshire's history. And the mill companies started to build housing by the mills, and that kind of started the birth of your beginnings of, planning communities. These industrial communities were laid out to where there's housing, where there's recreation, where there's their stores, all close to work. So that's kind of how planning originally started, within the Industrial Revolution. So zoning came to New Hampshire in 1925. The state legislature enacted the statutes that allowed New Hampshire municipalities the choice to adopt zoning. The first communities that quickly implemented zoning in 1926 was Keene, 1927 was Manchester, 1927 through 1930 was Nashua and Portsmouth, and 1930 was Concord. It's actually not really a coincidence that they're all cities. So the grant of power, again, is for the purpose of promoting the health, safety, and general welfare of the community. The local legislative body is town meeting form of government, or your city council or town council form of government, in which they are located, is authorized to adopt or amend a zoning ordinance. And the zoning ordinance by the RSAs shall be designed to regulate and restrict the height, number of stories of buildings, lot sizes, density, and location. Again, I'll go over a few more aspects of zoning, but those are, when you first think of zoning and trying to understand what it is and what its purpose is, the first, health, safety, and welfare of the community. And what that translates to is height of buildings. So think of the equitable building, lot sizes, percentage of lot that may be occupied. The equitable building took up the whole entire lot. So hopefully you can start to just see how zoning was started, and its general, initial purpose was to prevent communities from being developed like the equitable building. And with the US Supreme Court saying that municipalities have that ability, that legal ability to regulate those sizes and uses and coverages of land. So the RSAs again talk about the purposes of zoning ordinances. They shall be designed, and run through the whole list of what the purpose and intent of zoning is and what the zoning ordinances are intended to prevent and to enhance. Right there is, again, to promote the health and general welfare, provide adequate light and air, prevent overcrowding of land. Again, when you understand why that building in New York City started the whole thing, understand why zoning came to be, and the purpose and intent for that. New Hampshire did have a challenge to the constitutionality of zoning in 1928. That was 1 year after Manchester had passed and adopted zoning. It was challenged and heard in front of the New Hampshire Supreme Court. That case was Sundin versus Rogers. And in that case, the plaintiffs argued that zoning was an unconstitutional infringement upon property rights, and it is viewed as a taking. And you may hear that kind of discussion that circles around zoning, that it's unconstitutional and that it's a taking. But the Supreme Court disagreed, and in their decision, they cited and upheld the US Supreme Court's decision of Euclid versus Ohio. And the United States Supreme Court decision, as well as the New Hampshire Supreme Court decision, stated that the principle and practice of separating land uses into zones, aka zoning, is legal and a valid government interest and exercise in order to further the overall health and well-being of the community. And additionally, the New Hampshire Supreme Court ruled these general terms have already been held to include such regulations to promote the public health, safety, or morals and comfort of the community, or for the protection of property. So it's been tried and true on the U.S. federal court and the New Hampshire Supreme Court, that zoning is a valid interest for the municipalities. Within New Hampshire, there's 234 communities, 226 have a comprehensive zoning ordinance, 19 have no comprehensive zoning ordinance, 13 have some type of ordinance, whether it's floodplain, whether it's telecommunications. You may not be a traditional zoning ordinance, but if you've adopted those regulations, then you do have some form of zoning. And at this time, there are 6 communities without any type of zoning. And so a land use board. So you just got elected or appointed to a land use board. So a land use board, according to a definition through the RSA, means a planning board, historic district commission, a building inspector is considered in New Hampshire to be a land use board, a building code of appeals, zoning board, or their other board or commission authorized under RSA 673 that is established by the local legislative body. Again, local legislative body is town meeting form of government or your city council or town council form of government. The slide highlights the RSAs that describe each land use board. You've got the planning board, zoning board of adjustment, the other boards and commissions that can be authorized through a town meeting as far as being a land use board. And just as a point of order, some of you may be new members to the Conservation Commission, but the state of New Hampshire does not consider a Conservation Commission to be a local land use board. The Conservation Commission is defined in RSA 36A. So that just a little bit of a difference there, that the Conservation Commission is not considered a land use board by law, according to the state of New Hampshire. So I'm sure that you have seen this flow chart before if you've attended any of my previous webinars. This is just again to kind of lay out how it all comes together, how planning and zoning comes together. So a community decides whether or not they want to have a planning board, and that is once that has been done through legislative process, the planning board elects officers. Once the planning board elects officers, they have to adopt their rules of procedure. Once that is done, the planning board's main job at this point is to draft and create a master plan. Now we all know, because we've taken trainings before, that the master plan has 2 required chapters, the vision and the land use section, and that can be the bare minimum. There are communities out there that only have a vision and a land use section for their master plan. That's fine if that's what the community wants. But once you have the master plan, then you can go off into a few different directions. You can go strictly to subdivision regulations, and then that community has not adopted zoning. They only have, the planning board has power and authority over subdivision regulations. If that community chooses through the legislative process to adopt zoning, then it's the planning board's responsibility to draft the zoning ordinance. And then you have the zoning board of adjustment and branch off into site plan regulations. So you can't have site plan regulations unless you have zoning. So if you want to be able to regulate and to control the types and locations and sizes, whatever's of commercial, industrial, multifamily, then you need site plan regulations. And in order to have site plan regulations, you need zoning. In addition to that, in order to have a capital improvement program, as well as to implement impact fees, having zoning is required. So if you're a new planning board member or an existing planning board member, I'm sure you're aware that you do have you're in charge of a lot of stuff. Most importantly, like I mentioned, the master plan, the zoning ordinance are 2 major land use documents that you are in charge of, as well as your own regulations, which are subdivision, site plan, capital improvement plan, driveway regulations. The majority of the communities in New Hampshire are the regulators for excavation regulations. So the planning board, welcome to the planning board. You have a lot you're in charge of and a lot to work on. The planning board has regulatory and non-regulatory functions. So the non-regulatory functions of the planning board are, again, to review and draft regulations. When the planning board is updating the zoning ordinance, we all know the town meeting form of government that the zoning ordinance amendment time, they're held to strict public hearings and strict timeframes for that. Cities and town councils can adopt these zoning amendments at any time of the year, but you must hold at least public hearings to allow the public to speak. And that same goes for the excavation regulations, anything driveway regulations, anything to do with updating your regulations has to be done in the public hearing format. The other thing for your non-regulatory is just for the application process. So the zoning board of adjustment is different than the planning board. They do not have regulatory and non-regulatory responsibilities. The primary purpose of a zoning board of adjustment is to provide relief from regulations, or I like to say it's the safety valve. Because if you don't have any type of relief from regulations, then the argument can be made that a taking is going on. So when you have regulations, you've got to have some type of relief for someone who may need it. So that's what the zoning board of adjustment's main cause is that they are the ones to say yes or no. They're going to grant a variance. They're going to grant relief in some type of way. They do that through administrative appeals. If someone doesn't like a board decision or the building inspector's decision or a town planner's interpretation, then that decision can be appealed to the zoning board of adjustment. They have a statutory requirement to review variances, as well as special exceptions. But special exceptions are special in that it's based on the zoning ordinance criteria. So there's a little bit of tweaking that can go on with each community based on what each community wants their special exception criteria to be. A special exception application is a use that is allowed in that zone, but it needs a little bit extra review, just a little bit of a higher standard to get through instead of allowed by right. So say a dog kennel is a use allowed in rural residential. It's allowed by special exception. So that just means that, yes, what are you going to do about the zoning board has criteria, maybe that use in the rural residential zone, they can address noise, they can address lighting. There's whatever your criteria for your special exception items are in your zoning ordinance, then that application can ask to meet those requirements as well. And sometimes I get inquiries about, the planning board and the zoning board kind of changing lanes when it comes to special exceptions. A special exception review, the zoning board is bound to what the zoning ordinance says are the criteria for the special exception. So if your special exception criteria discuss hours of operation, safety to the public, adequate sanitary facilities or public facilities, those criteria, those are over here in the zoning board lane. Okay, when that application goes to the planning board, then the planning board will look at landscaping and hours and look at other options. So just to be very clear that the planning board and the zoning board should be working together, not at odds with each other, but also know their roles. And that the zoning board is specifically looking at criteria outlined in the zoning ordinance for what the special exception is. Equitable waivers are also something that the ZBA considers, and a motion for a rehearing is also something that they do. If someone is aggrieved by a decision, they can ask to be reheard, and the zoning board of adjustment can do a rehearing based on their own decision. The ZBA is known as a judicial board. They're quasi-judicial. They do not create regulations. They are not executive. They don't enforce regulations. They are quasi-judicial. So they are the ones that say yes or no, whether or not something in the zoning ordinance is allowed or not allowed, or allowed with certain conditions. They interpret the ordinance. They do not enforce their own decisions. That's the building inspector or whomever the governing body says is the enforcer of the zoning ordinance. So they are not legislative. They don't make regulations. They're not executive. They don't enforce regulations. They are quasi-judicial. They interpret. They make decisions of the ordinance and their own interpretations. So the ZBA process, you are expected to decide each case individually, and each case based on the evidence and the testimony for that particular case. If one neighborhood has have been granted variances for 10 garages, and that 11th garage comes in, maybe that 11th garage does not meet the criteria of a variance. So you've got to make sure that you're deciding your cases on that case's merits, not based on 10 other ones. So make sure that you're keeping an open mind to each case that comes in front of you based on its own merits. You can add conditions. You can approve, you deny, you can modify, but a ZBA can add conditions. If you have any issues or questions about adding conditions, I would highly recommend that you discuss with your town attorney. As always, discuss any type of procedural or decision-making processes with your town attorney. And keeping in mind when you're hearing applications in front of you for variances and special exceptions, those are the most common applications in front of the zoning board of adjustment. The burden of proof is on the applicant. They are asking you to break the rules for them. So the burden of proof is on them to make sure that their case, each individually, meets the criteria for a variance. And you shouldn't really have financial reasons play that much of a role to make the decision, to make or break that decision. If I want a 34 by 34 foot garage on my property, and it's going to be more expensive for me to have a 24 by 34, well, yeah, I can still have a 24 by 34. I'm not being taking rights of my property are being taken away. I can still have a garage. It's just that, well, yeah, it's cheaper, it's nicer, it's this, it's that. I wouldn't, speak with your town attorney, but that's not really the best way to start deciding on variances, whether or not it's cheaper or more expensive for an applicant to comply. Again, use your municipal attorney, like I said. Make sure that any decisions that you're making with your minutes and with your decisions are pretty clear, because if one of your cases goes to the courts will look at it and they need to know how you got to your decision. So make sure that discussion in the minutes is clear and that your decisions are clear. And as always, again, make sure that you are using your town attorney. When in doubt, it's okay to continue a ZBA application, to consult with your town attorney to get more information. I would recommend that versus making a decision in haste, and one that could open you up to more chances of being challenged in court. So as a board member, some tips on how you could be a good board member. So you've been either elected or appointed. So now you have the duty and responsibility to act on behalf of your community, to act on behalf of the people that voted for you and the people that, that appointed you. So it's important to do your homework. I know, especially for planning board members, you have a lot to be in charge. You're in charge of a lot. There's a lot of homework. You get handed a stack of regulations, zoning, master plan, subdivision, site plan, excavation, driveway. It's overwhelming. There's no doubt about it. But when an application comes in front of you and you've got a busy agenda, you owe it to the people that voted for you, the people that had faith in you to appoint you to that office, and that you've accepted it, to do your homework and to be prepared. It's a lot of time and money and energy and effort that goes into these applications and to these people coming before you. So doing your homework is making sure that they're getting the service that they should, and being fair and unbiased in your decision makings is another part of doing your homework. Understand what's being presented in front of you. And, it may not be something that you would, like in your backyard, but you're there to make decisions, and to be fair within your decisions is important as a board member, and to be unbiased. You've been appointed or elected. Again, people are counting on you to show up and do it on their behalf for the community. So make sure that you attend your meetings, look presentable as best you can, be on time, be respectful of the board and the people that are there coming in front of you. Work with staff if you have, there's staff, part-time staff, or work with the RPCs on learning the ordinances. They'll be glad to, staff should be, able to help you, kind of learn your way through the ordinances and learn what sections of the ordinances that applications coming through would apply to. So don't be afraid to reach out to staff and other board members for help with learning and navigating all of the regulations. It's important to cooperate with other boards. Planning board and zoning boards, you should really be cooperating with each other. Yes, you've got different purposes and different applications and different decisions, but when push comes to shove, you've all been appointed or elected to represent your community with your distinct roles. So you should be working together, especially when it comes to this issue of zoning amendments. The zoning board is seeing a lot of applications for a variance for a particular use or a particular zone coming in front of them. That should be a red flag that possibly a zoning amendment may help. There's something to talk to the planning board about. So make sure that you're cooperating with your other boards and be respectful to your fellow board members and most importantly, the public. Land use issues are very passionate. People have a lot of opinions about land use issues, and our meetings can get kind of heated. But please remember to try and be fair and be respectful of your fellow board members and of people attending. And work with your municipal attorney on policies and procedures for board members on board communications. It's do not communicate via email, because if there's more than one board member or several board members chatting on email, you're having an unnoticed meeting and you're opening up a huge can of worms. So I would encourage you at least once a year or so to sit down with your town attorney to review board communication policies. Speaking of board communication, don't use social media to discuss any applications. You should, you need to be unbiased, so you shouldn't be airing your opinions on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of the social medias out there. Be respectful of the process and be respectful of the applicant. And again, you need to be unbiased. So putting out opinions on particular applications that haven't been settled or in process is not good. Again, work with your town attorney, because you shouldn't be, again, going with developing any preconceived opinions. Work with your town attorney on that process.
Stephanie, we do have a topic on this question, or a question on this topic rather.
Sure.
From Grace, how do you deal with ZBA board members who publicly state that they are against zoning and act accordingly?
My non-legal opinion would be, I think that it would be time that you'd have a conversation with your governing body and with possibly your town attorney as to, and speaking with or to that member, that if they're on a zoning board of adjustment, but they don't believe in zoning or don't agree with zoning, then there may be some type of conflict there. That's really not the best scenario to have any land use board member, whatever board you're on, to talk disparagingly about that. So I'm not an attorney, but if it was a board member from a community that I was working in as a planner, then I would probably have a conversation again with the governing body and with the town attorney. And that's for your town attorney to make that decision as to, how to move forward with that type of zoning board member.
Great, thank you.
Hopefully that answered your question. Again, yeah, so, getting back to the kind of a point on question, don't express or have these preconceived opinions or agendas when you're a board member. You need to be fair and unbiased, and I'll keep repeating these kinds of themes because it's really important for board members to live up to those standards. Again, a lot of people have voted you into office. They've appointed you. They thought you can do the job. You've stepped up voluntarily to do the job, which also kudos for doing that as well. And coming with that is responsibility. You have decisions to make that will not always be popular, but you have to make those decisions. And so making those decisions means don't abstain. abstaining is unless you've been absent from something and you have no reason to vote on that, but you have a duty to vote and decide. That's why you've been put there. That's why you've been elected. So it's my planning opinion, abstaining is not productive, and you should really refrain from abstaining on applications. You need to participate. If it's something that you can't, if there's something that maybe you have a conflict of interest, then that's when you need to step down, recuse yourself, and have an alternate be placed, to act on the application. But don't simply just sit on an application and then abstain from voting for it. And work with your town attorney on that as well. When you do think that you need to recuse yourself, some of the most basic that the general person can understand is the juror standards. Now, do you expect to gain anything or lose anything financially or personally or professionally from this case? If you're related to any party, if you have advised or assisted any party, if I am a developer and there's an engineer or a surveyor on the planning board and I come in before them, that planning board member may want to consider recusing themselves when they've done work for me, based on the application that I've submitted in front of them. And when in doubt, don't. Okay, probably the best practice to do, if there's a recusal that comes up, is to you see an application on an agenda, call the chair, call the staff, and say, hey, there may be an issue here. That way, the chair and or staff can work to get an alternate in place or be ready to appoint an alternate if you do have to step down. The choice to step down ultimately lies with the board member, but perception of things is very big in how cases are decided and how applications are decided. So while it is your decision, it's that perception of, oh, I used to work for this engineering firm and now this engineering firm is in front of me and I'm going to sit and decide on this case. Those are things that you need to figure out on your own. If those types of things can be easily appealed, work with your town attorney. Again, I am not an attorney in any way, but this is coming from a planner's perspective where I would advise my board members, when in doubt, don't. Seems to be at least the safest way to go if there's a question of whether or not you should be recusing yourself. So just the alphabet soup, planners love, in the planning and zoning world, we love acronyms, right? So if you're a new member and you're not familiar with some of these acronyms, they get thrown around a lot and sentences can rattle on and continue. Oh yeah, they have an SUP and they have to go to TRC and then they get to go to the DOT. It sounds like we're just rattling off a bunch of letters. So these slides are just to kind of help you learn some of the language, PUD, RPCs are another thing that we throw around a lot. So just technical review committee, what a tip district is. These are all types of terms that you will easily see in the planning and zoning world. There's federal acronyms as well, FEMA, NFIP, the Federal Highway Administration, a Stormwater Protection Plan, all those types of things you will see as development plans. And the state offices are mostly, most of the acronyms that come from the state are DES, DOT, and DRA. You may have heard some unofficial acronyms that can pop up in the planning and zoning world. And some of these are a banana, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. You can have caveman, which are citizens against virtually everything. You have the famous NIMBY, YIMBY, and PITBY, put it in their backyard. So all of these are, a little tongue in cheek, but there's some things to consider when you're a board member is that you're going to have members of the public who are going to be passionate one way or another, that are going to come to their meetings. The best advice that I can give is to be fair and to make sure that as best you can, that the public and the applicants are understanding where you're coming from, whether that's to approve or deny. But one of the most important things to do is to be fair to the applicants that have come before you and to the public who have come before you. So thank you for stepping up and being a board member. Congratulations on board member and serving your town. So we have, looks like about 10-ish minutes left, and we'll move into the question and answer period now. So if there's anything in the chat, or if anyone would like to raise their hand, we will certainly take the questions now.
Great. We did have an earlier question, Stephanie, that I think is a reference out of our book, out of the ZBA book from Larry Briggs, saying Chapter 1, page I-9, our ZBA has a written procedure that allows us to elect a temporary chair if both the chair and the vice chair are absent for a meeting. Is that still allowed, or do we need to designate a secretary?
I would run through that process with your town attorney, but at least for the planning board, I have seen cases where, you know, the very odd rarely happen, and then you have that one time and then you don't know what to do. That the chair and the vice chair, whether for absences or recusals, that for the planning board, then the secretary then steps up for that particular meeting to be the chair. So I would check with your town attorney to see if that's something that the ZBA rules of procedure should have. You should have kind of a backup in place, but it's a good question. It's still something that, you know, that I think would recommend.
Great. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat currently. Oh, we just got one from Kyle.
Okay, hi Kyle.
Can you talk more about potential conditions set forth by the ZBA as part of an approval? We've been told by our attorney that neither land use board, planning, or ZBA have the authority to bind the other to take any particular action on an application. However, we have interpreted this as if the ZBA places a condition on specific criteria of a special exception or variance, that shall remain as part of the approval. But if they place a condition that falls under site plan or subdivision, that would be advisory only, and the planning board does not have to follow that recommendation during the approval process. Are we interpreting this correctly?
I think that my, you know, non-legal planner hat, in my experience, when an application came through and there was a special exception approval before it or whatever, is that the ZBA conditions of approval have to be included. They can't be superseded. They can't be, you know, overruled. So the planning board could, you know, take them into consideration and acknowledge that they're there. Again, it kind of goes along a little bit with ZBA staying in their lane, planning board staying in your lane as well, is that ZBA special exceptions with conditions of approval, if they're related to what's outlined in the zoning ordinance. If the ZBA starts going out of their lane and starts making conditions of approval that are really the purview of the planning board, well, then you're getting messy. But I think that ZBA conditions of approval on a variance or on a special exception, they should be acknowledged and included with the planning board. And the planning board can also have their own conditions of approval. So I hope that kind of answered your question, Kyle. Let me know, I can clarify.
Okay, not seeing any more questions at the moment. I did just drop the link to an anonymous webinar survey in
Okay.
the chat. I also want to note, and we have one other question. I just want to note real quickly that for folks that want to delve into any of these topics more deeply, our annual planning and zoning conference is coming up on Saturday, May 11th. We'll have a whole planning board track and a whole zoning board of adjustment track, as well as a historic preservation housing track. And I will drop the link for our conference in case any of you have not received an invite to that yet in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. We have our planning and zoning again. We've tried it. I think this is maybe the second year in a row, could be third. I think it's the second year in a row where we are having sessions for the ZBA Q&A. which is a free-for-all session. It's based on, the morning sessions for the ZBA, the workings of the ZBA and the ZBA New Hampshire. And the speakers and previous attendees have seemed to like that format, where there's a whole session at the end of the day where you can ask questions from the morning session as well as any other ZBA questions that you have. Planning board has the same thing. The planning board has the planner is in, which is at the end of the day, which will be myself. It'll be Steve Buckley and Ben Frost. For the ZBA, it's Chris Bolt and Stephen Whitley and Matt Surge are doing the ZBA tracks. For the planner is in ZBA Q&A, for you to ask questions and maybe have some of your own situations that you can have answered at the planner is in or ZBA Q&A.
Great. All right. So we do have a couple of more questions and comments coming in. WRT, I'm not sure what that is. The juror standard for variance considered by ZBA. Does it apply only to conflict of interest and recusals, or does it mean ZBA members are only allowed to consider information presented by others at a hearing on a variance? That is, can a ZBA member use information developed on their own when justifying a decision as long as it is discussed at the meeting?
Okay, hang on. Let me read that for a second. Okay, the juror standard for variance is going to be the juror standard is for recusals. So if there's a question, in my opinion, which should be clarified again with your town attorney, but I would use a juror standard just whether or not someone should recuse themselves. And the juror standards would be if you can answer yes to those juror standards, yes, I'm going to gain financially or lose financially, or, yes, this is a family member. That's kind of an obvious recusal, type of scenario. But that's what I'm talking about when I talk about recusals. ZBA members are only allowed to consider information presented by others at a hearing at a variance. Can a ZBA? That's something that I would review with your town attorney as far as a ZBA member use information developed on their own or justifying decision as long as it's discussed on a meeting. I mean, you can dabble a little bit into what the New Hampshire Supreme Court has said, what board members can use their own knowledge of their town if this development is right in front of their street and they know the traffic there, they know it's really busy in the summer, it dies down in the fall. But I'm not qualified to give you sure direction on that. So I would, defer you to your town attorney to ask for specific direction. But for my purposes from the website, from the slides, is that juror standard is to when you think you should recuse yourself. Also keeping in mind, I get it. We've seen it, small town, people are going to know each other. The best thing to do is that you can say, Mr. Chairman, I worked with this person, for 5 years, or I, explain, the connection. And there is leeway for small towns where everybody knows everybody. I've done work for that person. But the best thing to do is to make sure that you're speaking about it up front, and that everyone is aware of it. And again, the final decision relies on you, whether or not you should recuse yourself. It's all about perception. So keep that in mind if you're doing that consideration, if it's a gray area.
Great. We have a question about, is there a concise and real-time resource, website, RSS feed for board members to remain informed on upcoming New Hampshire legislation that may be relevant or impactful or relevant to their own zoning ordinances? I'm going to take that question, Stephanie, if
Sure.
that's okay.
Absolutely.
So the New Hampshire Municipal Association started utilizing a service called Fast Democracy, which anybody can sign up for. They have a planning, zoning, and land use list. I'm going to drop the link to that in the chat, which you can subscribe to for regular updates. We will be doing with NHMA a joint memo, which we started doing a couple years ago after the conclusion of this legislative session in June, to provide guidance to all of you on how to interpret planning and zoning related legislation may have been passed. And then we typically will do a webinar as well on that, either in the midsummer, early fall. So just keep an eye out on that. And if you have any other specific questions about a specific piece of legislation, feel free. I also put my contact information in the chat. Folks, feel free to reach out to me directly. One more question came in. From Richard, what role should a board member or alternate who stands to benefit financially have in preparing updates to the master plan?
I'm assuming that means benefit financially in town as far as, or what specifically stands financially from doing the master plan, if it's a consultant, maybe a little clarification on that. But if any board member has a concern about another board member's behavior, public tweets, similar to what we said before, something about a zoning board member publicly state they're against zoning. Those types of things should be, in my opinion, non-legal, just plenaries. You should be discussing that with your governing body and involving the town attorney. There's a difference between, someone who's a business owner who's sitting on the economic development committee. Is that a conflict? Is that out of bounds? Not sure. If that community person is also on the master plan looking to, bring in more business to the area, I mean, some of these things can be a push. But if it's something that is really, obvious that, hey, I, own a car dealership and I'm really pushing for, no car dealerships to be in town. I want to be the only one. If it's something like that, then you may need to have a discussion as far as maybe that person could be on a different committee. But, all of these, it's kind of just this big bowl of what's the common sense. Okay, especially when you're dealing with small towns, or especially when you're dealing with lack of volunteers, you're going to have some connection. You're going to have one board member that's worked on a project. You're going to have somebody that's going to gain, that's going to lose. It's inevitable in some way, shape, or form. But use your common sense. If it's very obvious, then I suggest that you, again, talk with the governing body, talk with the town administrator, bring in the town attorney and have that conversation, because it's better to have that conversation than to have this perception and to have this image of board members sitting on a board so that they gain financially. That's not a stereotype that you want your local boards to have. It's worth a conversation to have with your town attorney and the governing bodies.
Great. I am not seeing any more questions. I think we have addressed them all. We are at 12:59.
Okay.
Stephanie,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you want to wrap it up.
Sure. If there's one more, anybody have any, we started a few minutes late. If there's one more chance, does someone have a quick question? You certainly be glad to answer that. If not, I want to thank everybody for attending today. And I have some parting advice is, as board members, thank you for stepping up for your community. You're doing the best you can. And just make sure that you are utilizing your town attorney and that you're not letting applicants or developments, strong arm you into a decision. When in doubt, don't. Some of my tips. So thank you again for attending today. Thank you again for stepping up for your community. And check out our website. We're always here to help and with our training and our bulletins and our webinars and conferences. So thank you very much.